Hello, my name is Alexandre Lepin. I'm the new director of the Center for French and Francophone Studies, and I'm restarting the center from scratch, and I couldn't do it without the help of my assistants, Todd Jacob, who couldn't be here, Darina Pugacheva, Emily Odell, and Jean Jegousseau, who are all doing a marvelous job in this immense task that is facing us. So this is the first lecture of our Distinguished Speakers series, and I'm very pleased to welcome here Professor Jacques Brasseul. Professor Jacques Brasseul has written a great number of books that are in use in French universities in the teaching of economic history. Let me mention among all those big books the L'Histoire des faits économiques, 3 volumes, History of Economic Facts, 3 volumes. And why did he need 3 volumes? Because he considers history of economy from the Paleolithic or Neolithic to up to today. And another book, notable book that I would like to mention is Jacques Brasseul, Un monde meilleur, with a question mark, a better world, which is a new approach of economic globalization that upsets some cliche about this huge movement in the modern world. What I like in Jacques' oeuvre is the fact that there is as much as history as economics. So it makes it fascinating for everybody, and he has an ample culture in history as well as in economics. So Jacques Brasseul, thank you for coming here. You're the first distinguished speaker, and I'm sure you will be up to the task.
Thank you.
Non, mais j'aimerais faire le fil pour le livre. Ça n'avait pas compris.
I would like to thank you for being here, and thank also my colleague, Alexandre, and good friend, for inviting me in this great university. Although I'm afraid my poor mastering of the English language might be a bit difficult for everybody, and especially for me. Of course, you cannot speak about the history of Africa, which spans millions of years, in a 1-hour conference. So I choose some topics that might be of interest. 3 questions, in fact, only. 1 in far away prehistory. The second one in the Neolithic times. I mean, the Bantu expansion. And the last one in more recent times, the economic situation of Africa in the last 200 years. The first question is about the origins of humanity, and most prehistorians agree on one thing: the origins of humanity are in Africa. And mankind emigrated from Africa to people the whole world. It has always seemed a bit strange to me that we know so little about our origins, because after all, it's our history. We don't know much about the outer space, the galaxies, and so on, but that seems normal. But not knowing much about ourselves, where we come from, has always seemed a bit strange to me. Of course, the reason is obvious. Writing was invented about 4,000 years ago, and we have a lot of writing since then, but before that, in the hundred or thousand of years, there's not much, except remains and artifacts, and we have to see that prehistorians don't agree between them. There are different theories, competing theories. They fight between one another, and we're not sure about much. But one thing is sure, is that we all come from Africa. So the first question is the question out of Africa. It starts about 7 million years ago with the first hominids. Then we have the formation of the rift in East Africa. That is a collapse in the earth crust that separated the forest from the savanna at the east. And it is the time when these hominids became bipeds, started to walk on their two legs. And this story is called the East Side story, because on one side you had the hominids who stayed in the forest, and on the other side, the first bipeds who walked in the savanna. It's a theory of Professor Yves Coppens, and it's the beginning of mankind. And the fact of standing up allows, of course, to see from afar the predators, and it also frees the arms and the hands to carry loads, food, to use weapons and different tools, and not only to run on the ground or to grasp a branch in the forest. It gives a first advantage to man versus animals. But what is less known is that standing on your feet, the vertical position, allows also the heat of the sun to rest on a smaller part of the body, only on the top, while the animals have their whole body exposed to the heat. And so, in those climates, equatorial or tropical, man could go on longer distances in the day. It had less necessity to stop in the middle of the day to rest. He could hunt for a longer time and go on longer distances than animals. And that's a clear advantage. And also the fact of being erect implies less heat because you're exposed to the wind instead of staying at the level of the ground where it's very hot and very humid. And it can explain the growth of the brain because the brain was more ventilated all the time. compared to the other animals. Let's go back to the theory of the origin of man in Africa. The first scientist who formulated this idea was Charles Darwin, and it was an intuition, but it's proved right in the next decades or century, because most of the remains are found in Africa. And we have different types of men, as you see here. Homo habilis, the first tools, about 2 million years ago. Homo erectus, with a larger brain. And much later, nearly 2 million years later, 1.5 million, you have Homo sapiens. And finally, our species, Homo sapiens sapiens. Homo sapiens sapiens appears 70,000 years ago, and it's considered as a great leap forward, because a number of inventions date from this time, like the languages, the different languages, like the different weapons, like spears, bows, arrows, but also jewels, hooks for fishing, harpoons, ropes, houses, canoes, clothes, and of course, art. The great frescoes like Lascaux in France, or Altamira in Spain date from this time. Homo sapiens sapiens appeared first in Africa, and from there, people the rest of the world. But it is not the only migration. In fact, there are two waves of migration, because there was the first one, long time before Homo sapiens sapiens. The first one was 1 million years ago. Homo erectus left already Africa. And that is little known because we consider only one wave, but in fact there were two waves of emigration out of Africa, very distant from one another. And the first wave, we can see it here. Men went out of Africa to Asia 1 million years ago, about 500,000 to Europe, 40,000 years ago to Oceania, and finally 12,000 years ago to the Americas. And in Europe, the descendant of those men, those archaic men, who people in the first wave, the whole world, are called the Neanderthal men. And when the second wave started, Homo sapiens sapiens, coming out of Africa, met in Europe Neanderthal man. And Neanderthal man, as you know, became extinct, though they were mixed between the two, the Homo sapiens sapiens and Neanderthal man. What is less known also is the fact that in the second wave, it was only a small group of men at the start getting out of Africa. The prehistorian estimate them at a few hundred. Imagine that, a few hundred men crossing the Sinai Desert between Africa and Asia, and those few hundreds peopled the whole world. And this is proved by the fact that the same DNA is found in all the continents: Europe, Asia, Middle East, Oceania, America. It proves that it was from this small group, those few hundred men, that the whole world was peopled. While in Africa itself, the DNA is much more diverse than in the rest of the world, showing that the people who stayed in Africa were very different from one another compared to the few hundred who went out of Africa. This is my first question. The fact that we all come from Africa and how it was realized. My second question is about the Bantu expansion. Some historians of Africa, specialists, speak about it in this way. You see it, a major contribution to the history of mankind, Gyan and Guignan, one of the greatest, if least dramatic, migrations in human history. A British historian of Africa, Ian Eilif, and another British historian, and even unmatched in world history. So what about the Bantu expansion? When I was at school in the 60s, nobody taught us anything about the history of Africa, except maybe about empire, colonization, but not anything else. And perhaps it's different now, I don't know. Perhaps it's different in the United States. I don't know how African history is taught. But in my time, we didn't know anything about it. It was just like Africa had no history, which of course is ridiculous. But it was the mentality of the times. And I learned a lot reading about Africa, African history, African economic history, filling the gaps. And the Bantu expansion was one event I didn't know much about. I don't know about you, but it was like news to me. And to understand this expansion, we have to start with the birth of farming, the birth of agriculture. Farming and breeding, which constitutes what is called the Neolithic Revolution, about 10,000 years ago. The Neolithic Revolution, the invention of agriculture, is the first great economic revolution of mankind. The second great economic revolution is the one we are living now. I mean, the Industrial Revolution that started in the 1760s in England and Scotland. We are still in the middle of it nowadays. But the Neolithic Revolution, the invention of agriculture and breeding, had enormous consequences. And these consequences are told here by another historian, two other historians of Africa. I recommend their book, A Short History of Africa, Penguin. And this sentence is very interesting. Agriculture made possible the settled life of the village, as opposed to the moving hunting camp. It made possible the accumulation of equipment on a scale impossible before, Of course, the nomadic hunter could not carry much load, but in the village you could accumulate equipment, made a whole difference. And it made finally possible for the first time population densities expressible in terms of men per square mile rather than square mile to the map. So it started in the Fertile Crescent about 10,000 years ago. And you see here the main centers of start of the Neolithic Revolution, the invention of agriculture. From an independent way, without being propagation or imitation. And you see that after the Fertile Crescent, you have China, 7,000 years ago, and you have Africa, West Africa, the Sahel, about 6,000 years ago. No, sorry. I'm confused here. 8,000 years ago, 10,000 years ago, that means 8,000 before Common Era, before Christ. 7,000 before Common Era, that means 9,000 years ago. And 8,000 years ago, 6,000 before Christ in Africa. And finally, in the Americas, it was about 3,500 years ago. At the time, the Sahara, the Great Desert, was green. It stayed green about from 9,000 to 2,000 and a half before Christ. And we can see that by the numerous frescoes in the center of the Sahara now, in the Tassili Desert, like this one here, people breeding cattle. Much later, Africa, south of the desert, when the Sahara became a desert, Africa entered the Iron Age, about 700 to 400 before Christ. Another revolution in the tools and weapon used, of course more efficient than the stone ones used before that. And that led to an increase in food production, and also, of course, more food means more people, so a demographic revolution too. But this demographic revolution, in fact, started much before with the invention of agriculture itself. Why the demographic expansion at the time? Mainly from a surge in natality. More babies, not much from mortality, but mainly natality. The reason is simple. The nomads, the gatherers, hunters, they had to move all the time. So they couldn't carry small children. They couldn't carry more than one baby at a time. So the birth has to be distant from one another. But with the invention of agriculture in the settled village, you can have many more babies because they stay around. You don't have to carry them from one camp to another. At the beginning, agriculture was limited to West Africa and East Africa, Ethiopia, as you see on the map. And the rest of Africa was peopled by hunters and gatherers. And that explains the Bantu expansion. At the beginning, the Bantus used to live at the north of the equatorial forest around present Nigeria and Cameroon. And they were farmers, farming people, breeding. They mastered weaving, pottery, and as we just said, ironworking. And they had a clear advantage with the hunters, gatherers. They progressively pushed back. The north and the west the north and the west of the initial area of the Bantu was also peopled by farmers. So they could expand only to the south or to the east. And this is what happened. They started moving at about 3,000 before Christ, in a long continuous movement towards South Africa, towards East Africa. They crossed the forest, the great forest of the equatorial zone, and they used the huge network of rivers, as you can see here, to move progressively southward and eastward using canoes and rafts to go across the forest. And they cleared part of the forest, pushing back the hunters-gatherers, like the pygmies who lived there. Finally, the Bantu expansion came to the south. They pushed back all the hunters and gatherers and pastor population. They create states like the Great Zimbabwe, like the Congo. And it was an expansion that took like 4 millenniums, 4,000 years. And we can see nowadays the Bantu people on the map. It's all the light green areas from initial zone, Cameroon, to South Africa and to East Africa. The pace of this expansion was very slow. It is estimated at about 20 kilometers, that's 12 miles per decade. So 200 kilometers per century, 2,000 kilometers by millennium. Therefore, it is not a lightning conquest like the Arab conquest in the 7th and 8th century. And when we read a sentence like this one, the ancient Bantus who expanded towards Central and South Africa had probably among them men like Alexander the Great or Napoleon, but we will never know much about them. When we read such a sentence, it has to be taken with a bit of doubt, because such a slow expansion can hardly be compared to a conquest. It moved very slowly, year after year, decade after decade, century after century. And when the Bantus adopted iron work and iron tools and iron weapons, they were even more efficient, and the conquest tended to accelerate at the end. That's what Jared Diamond, says when he speaks about a military industrial package impossible to stop in the equatorial Africa of the times. The use of ironwork, iron tool, and weapons compared to the people who lived there before. The Bantus brought also their disease, like the Europeans when they went to the Americas, bringing the disease. The Bantus brought malaria, and they were immune to this disease, and the people, the gatherers, Khoisan people, were not. So you can compare this conquest, this invasion, this occupation to the conquest of the Americas and the effect of disease brought by the conquerors. So that is my second question. You can speak of a migratory drift, gradual advance, hardly conquest like the word would imply. And let's start with the past, so far away, Paleolithic times, Neolithic times, and come to our times, contemporary times. For my third question. The third question is about the development gaps, that is to say the differences in economic development between the different continents. Let's have a look on the last 2 centuries. We start with the end of the slave trade, the Atlantic slave trade, which ended in the first part of the 19th century, from 1807, when the British abolished the slave trade and started to chase the slave ships. And this lasted for about 5 to 6 decades, and the slave trade ended really in the 1860s. The last slave ships can be observed as arriving in Cuba or Brazil in the 1860s. Then we have the colonization phase between 1880 and 1960, and finally the independence in Africa from the 1960s. Africa is the poorest continent, and we have to try shortly here to explain why. What are the reasons? To my point of view, but it's only one among many, the main explanation is geography. And I'll see that in those 3 points, 3 geographic explanations that can account from the lagging of Africa. Many explanations are different. For instance, the slave trade is the accused, or colonization is made responsible. But it doesn't make sense to me, because I think Africa was the victim of slave trade and colonization because there was a gap at the beginning. Otherwise, it could have been the contrary. It could have been African states that take slaves in Europe or the Muslim world. There was a big technological difference. The Europeans had the guns, had the ships, had the machines, had the economic power, and they could submit Africa, take slaves in Africa, and then colonize the whole continent, because there was a difference at the start. This difference was not created by those events, slave trade and colonization, but slave trade and colonization were the consequence of an initial gap. So that's what we have to explain. What about geography? The first explanation lies in isolation. Africa is surrounded by oceans. West, the Atlantic, and the east, the Indian Ocean, south also. And it has another ocean at the north, the desert, the great desert we spoke about a few minutes ago. The Sahara has always been considered as an ocean. There were, of course, caravans, but it took like 3 months to cross the desert. And the point of departure and the points of arrival were called ports, just like the ports of the Atlantic coast of Europe and the ports of America. So we can consider the whole continent as surrounded by oceans. Of course, there were contacts, communication, but it was more isolated than any part of Eurasia. And if you consider the other continents like Australia, Oceania, and the Americas, those continents were even more isolated than Africa. But still, Africa is a world apart from Eurasia. And this isolation, geographical isolation, prevented the communications of ideas, inventions that took place in the fertile crescent in the Middle East, like writing, like the wheel, like use of money, and so on. So we have a first disadvantage, geographical disadvantage for Africa, while those inventions easily propagated to Europe, easily propagated to India and to China from the origins, the Fertile Crescent. The second geographical explanation is the coastline. The coastline of Africa is much more rectilinear, straight, than the coastline of most other continents. And on this straight coastline, the waves are crashing, what in French-speaking Africa is called the bar, and it makes difficult the navigation, of course. You have to cross the crashing waves to go at sea, and of course, maritime expeditions are rendered more difficult, and faraway fishing enterprises are also more difficult because of this straight coastline. And a second fact about this coastline is that you have much less natural harbors in Africa than you have, for instance, in Europe. There is not many big bays, big gulfs, big sounds, big creeks and coves when boats can rest in still waters. There are, of course, natural ports, but nothing to compare with the myriads of ports, natural ports in Asia, Oceania, or Europe. So, for this reason, it's difficult to launch boats, ships, and have trade, exchange economic exchange between the different regions, the different states of the continent. The whole continent is much more massive than any other. And for instance, an historian of Africa says, Ralph Austin says, travels and transport by sea were limited because Africa has a small length of coast in relation to the interior surface area. Europe, on the contrary, is first a peninsula. It's the peninsula of Eurasia, the western peninsula of the whole continent of Eurasia. And when you look at this big peninsula that is Europe, you can see that it's also a peninsula made of different peninsulas inside. Italy is a peninsula. Spain is a peninsula. Greece is a peninsula. Scandinavia is a peninsula. So Europe is a peninsula of peninsulas. And moreover, in Europe you have many islands, big islands, like Britain, Ireland, all the islands of the Mediterranean Sea, and the thousands of islands of countries like Greece, Croatia. So it explains why transport by sea, communication by sea, trade by sea was so much more easier. On the one hand, you have many more natural ports, natural harbors, and on the other hand, you have short distances to cross, to go to another part, to another country, to another region, when you can trade, where you can learn, when you can communicate. So transport was easier, trade was easier than in Africa. And this is a very important point because trade allows specialization. If countries can trade easily, they will specialize in the goods they are good at making. Trade means specialization. Specialization means more efficiency. And efficiency means economic growth. So economic growth came much more easily in the Mediterranean, in the Middle East, in Europe, that it could come in Africa, where self-sufficiency was the rule in most places. So that's the second geographical explanation, the coastline. And the third explanation is given by the great anthropologist, Jared Diamond. It's the north-south versus east-west orientation of the continents. There's an S missing here. What about that? I think it's a well-known explanation, but I will say it briefly. When you have an east-west orientation of the continent like Eurasia, look at Eurasia, it goes from Europe to China on a huge distance, about 14,000 kilometers. And the main point of Diamond explanation is that you have the same climate all over. You have the same climate in Europe or China and all the way towards one another. That means that plants can propagate, that methods of farming can propagate, and animals used for domestication can be used anywhere in the same way. So the ideas can propagate easily. But when you have a continent like America, or less so Africa, which is north-south oriented, propagation of ideas, methods, plants, animals is much more difficult. Why? Because you change from a moderate climate to an arid climate, to a tropical climate, to an equatorial climate, to again tropical, then arid, then temperate. And it's not the same plants. It cannot be the same methods of culture. So each layer of north-south areas is in fact an obstacle, an impediment to the propagation of plants and ideas. And you can show that on the map from Jared Diamond itself. The east-est orientation of Eurasia around 14,000 kilometers compared to the north-south orientation of the other continents. And when you take the larger span of North America and the larger span of South America, it's about 5,000 kilometers. And in Africa, it's about 7,000 compared to the 14,000 of Eurasia. And in Africa, it's mostly desert in the largest east-west orientation. At best, the Sahel climate, which is, as everybody knows, difficult for farming. So that is the last explanation, the last geographical explanation. And I come now to my conclusion. What is astonishing when you look at the economic history of Africa is the fact that in spite of all these obstacles, natural obstacles, geographical obstacles, the economic history of the last 2 centuries in Africa is one of rapid development. Contrary to the common belief that Africa is lagging, it's exactly the contrary. Africa has crossed in 2 centuries what Europe and Asia took millenniums, maybe 8,000, 10,000 millenniums to cross. So it's the most rapid development in human history, what happened in Africa in the last 2 centuries. So the right question is not why Africa is poor, but rather what explains the quick narrowing of the gap, the closing of the differences. When you take, for instance, a common indicator, which is the life expectancy, the life expectancy can be considered as showing everything. If the life expectancy is long, it means you are well fed, you have security, you have health, you have good systems of health, you have high standard of living. So it can be used as synthesizing all the rest, all the economic indicators. In 1950, the life expectancy in Africa was 35 years. In 2013, it was 57 years. So Africa gained 22 years, from 35 to 57, in like 60 years. And when you take the life expectancy in the West, in the 1950s it was 65 years, and in the 2010s it is 75 years. So it's a gain of 10 years. Africa gained 22 years, while the West gained 10 years. So it shows a closing of the gap. The gap was much bigger in the 1950s. It is much narrower now, and even closing more each year. So what can explain this quick development of Africa, contrary to the common idea? I think it's the adaptability of the African people. It's It has no match in the world. I think the Africans are very good at adapting to new circumstances. And you can see that in the American continent very well. That's my conclusion. Thank you.